Snow drifted like torn lace across the low settlement, soft as breath and cold as regret. Lanterns glowed behind frosted windows where families prepared for Christmas with laughter, warmth, and pine-scented kitchens. Yet in one crooked cabin at the farthest edge, Alice May Latham stirred a heavy pot of winter stew, while wind clawed at the shutters and loneliness settled over her shoulders like a second coat. The fire hissed weakly, unable to chase away the biting draft or the hollowness inside her chest. Her stepmother, Hester Latham, watched with narrow eyes and a mouth that never softened. She believed obedience was duty, and love a luxury wasted on ungrateful girls. Alice had learned long ago that kindness could be demanded but not given, that a raised hand could replace every forgotten hug. Every bruise beneath her sleeves was a fading testimony to the language Hester preferred when Alice questioned a command or paused to breathe. Alice worked like a servant from dawn until the last candle flickered out, kneading bread, scrubbing pans, ironing linens for neighbors who paid pennies. She sang softly to herself when nobody listened, remembering a childhood where her father told stories by lamplight. After his passing, the cabin became a kingdom ruled by bitterness. Hester scolded her for crying at the burial, and told her grief was sentimental nonsense. Alice dried her eyes and folded into silence, the way a wildflower closes against night. As Christmas neared, Hester announced that Alice would marry Jedediah Crowley, a miner whose boots smelled of whiskey and whose tongue stung sharper than a switch. He needed a cook and a housekeeper, and Hester needed coin. Jedediah eyed Alice as though she were a sack of potatoes whose freshness might spoil, and Alice felt her stomach coil with dread. She imagined mornings steeped in sour ale and evenings echoing with curses. She imagined no tenderness, no reprieve, no possibility of belonging. Jedediah returned often, pounding on the door with impatience. He complained that Alice was too delicate and needed roughening. Hester agreed with a chuckle, pouring him another drink from the bottle hidden beneath her quilts. Alice remained at the stove, breathing through the sting of humiliation. The stew simmering before her smelled of carrots, onions, and sorrow. She carried bowls to the table with quiet hands, hoping no one would see how they trembled. The wedding was planned for the week after Christmas. Hester told the neighbors Alice should feel blessed, for a woman could not afford to remain unmarried. Alice nodded politely in front of strangers, but inside her lungs tightened until every breath tasted like captivity. Jedediah winked whenever he caught her gaze, confident that ownership was as good as affection. Alice felt less like a bride, and more like a possession traded for winter coal. One bitter evening, after Jedediah slapped her wrist for serving his bowl with too little salt, Alice excused herself to the small storeroom. She leaned against sacks of flour and muffled her sobs in her sleeve. A small photograph of her father lay tucked inside her apron. She traced his gentle smile with her thumb, and whispered that she missed him more than life. She promised him she would not surrender her future to cruelty if she could help it. Snow deepened outside until the settlement seemed buried beneath a quiet, white grief. Alice packed a small bundle while Hester slept. 2 biscuits wrapped in cloth, a tin cup, her father's photograph, and a plain woolen shawl. She studied the cabin for the last time. The familiar table worn smooth by elbows, the stove where she had learned to cook, the walls that had heard every unspoken prayer. She bowed her head and apologized to the memory of her father for leaving without ceremony, though she knew he would have begged her to choose freedom. Alice stepped outside into a night so still that even the moon held its breath. The cold bit at her cheeks, yet she felt strangely awake, as though every snowflake carried the promise of deliverance. She walked across fields where wheat once waved golden in summer, now shorn and sleeping beneath glittering frost. The only sound was her own heartbeat, steady and terrified. The silence felt heavy tonight. Hours passed. Wind pushed against her like invisible hands. Hunger gnawed, but she refused to stop. She imagined Jedediah waking to find her gone, Hester cursing the choice. But she also imagined possibility. Land beyond the settlement, cabins where strangers might offer a kind word or a crust of bread without demanding submission. Trees grew taller around her, their branches heavy with white hush. Bird tracks dotted the snow like tiny confessions. She passed a ridge and froze. Ahead, smoke curled from a chimney nestled against a valley of towering pines. The cabin appeared sturdy, older than the settlement, as though carved from solitude itself. She knocked weakly, more hope than strength. The door remained shut. She backed away, doubting herself, but rounded the cabin to seek another soul. There, beneath snow-threaded light, a giant figure split firewood with bare arms, each swing controlled and precise. His hair fell across broad shoulders, black as midnight, and steam rose from his skin where snowflakes dared to land. Alice's breath caught in her throat, not from fear but awe. The man lifted another log, unaware she watched. Her shawl slipped, and she tried to steady her trembling. Her vision narrowed, her breath turning shallow, the winter whispering that she was no longer alone before darkness fell. The world blurred. Alice's exhaustion surged like a tide. She whispered a plea for mercy, though she did not know if anyone heard. Snow spiraled upward as though summoned by angels. Her knees weakened, and consciousness scattered like frost beneath sunlight. She reached toward the cabin as the figure turned, his gaze sharp and startled. Before she could speak, the ground rose to meet her, gentle as a cradle, and everything turned into swirling silver and white. Sayon Black Mountain lived where the land preferred solitude over company. His cabin stood beneath a ring of silent pines, as if nature itself guarded the secrets he carried. Most settlers whispered about the enormous Apache, who hunted alone and rarely visited town, claiming he was too dangerous or too proud to join Christmas gatherings. Sayon never bothered correcting them. Words were tools he used sparingly, and his dignity asked for no applause. He belonged to the mountains, to the sound of elk hooves on frozen earth, to the hush of falling snow. Before sunrise, Sayon knelt beside a woven basket of pine kindling and added a thick log to the fire. Yesterday had been another long day of hauling lumber and repairing a saddle for a traveling rancher. The quiet felt heavier as winter deepened, yet he accepted it. Loneliness, once unwelcome, had become as familiar as the creak of the cabin door. He ate hearty stew from a tin bowl, grateful for fire and shelter, knowing many men slept under tarps or not at all. The world beyond these mountains felt loud and unpredictable, while the valley moved with gentle certainty. Little Elk, a quiet boy with sorrowful eyes, slept on a small pallet near the hearth. Sayon had found him 3 winters earlier after a fever carried away the child's parents. The boy never asked for more than shelter and simple chores. He rarely spoke, yet his silent company softened the edges of Sayon's isolation. The two understood each other without ceremony, souls shaped by loss, surviving through routine. Just before dawn, a gust rattled the shutters. Sayon stepped outside wearing only deerskin trousers and moccasins, not minding the frost against his bare chest. Cold sharpened his senses. A fresh layer of snow rested over the valley, turning yesterday's footsteps into soft ghosts. He split wood with steady rhythm, letting the thud of axe against log echo between the trees. He liked the certainty of labor, the simplicity of motion, the absence of judgment. When he lifted another log, a strange unease touched him. It felt like distant sorrow drifting toward him across the white landscape. He paused, listening. The valley exhaled nothing but wind and pine. He continued chopping until movement near the cabin caught his eye. A figure stumbled into view, shawl torn by branches, boots buried to the ankles. She reached out as if trying to speak, but the words froze in the air before they formed. Sayon rushed forward, snow crunching beneath his steps. The young woman collapsed, her body folding into the drift, as if winter had stolen her final strength. With instinctive gentleness, he gathered her into his arms. She weighed less than he expected, fragile as a dove fallen from its nest. Her cheeks were icy, her pulse unsteady, her lips trembling without sound. He carried her inside with careful urgency, nudging the cabin door open with his shoulder. Little Elk stirred, rubbing his eyes at the sight of a stranger. Sayon placed the woman on a pallet beside the fire, and wrapped her in buffalo hides. Her boots were soaked, so he removed them and set them near the hearth to dry. He boiled water quickly, placing steaming cloths on her hands, then brewed a small mixture of cedar and mint to ease her breath. The cabin filled with the scent of healing herbs and wood smoke. Alice drifted between waking and rest, hearing the distant murmur of a deep voice, steady, calm, never demanding. Hours passed before her eyelids fluttered open. The cabin glowed softly, flames licking the iron stove, shadows dancing on the walls. She blinked at the gentle flicker, unsure if this was safety, or a dream she feared would vanish. Seyon sat nearby, repairing a leather strap with quiet precision. His presence felt unassuming, a mountain shaped into human form. She studied him, startled by the sheer breadth of his shoulders, the calm strength of his posture, the way he seemed carved from patience rather than pride. She tried to speak, her throat aching, but only a breath escaped. Seyon set aside the strap and handed her a cup of broth. He guided her hand without touching her skin, showing her how to sip. Heat spread through her chest like a returning heartbeat. She whispered thank you with timid gratitude. He nodded once, as though such words were unnecessary. Alice feared she had wandered into danger. Stories told by settlers insisted Apache men were ruthless and quick to anger. Yet she felt no threat here. When Seyon stepped back to give her space, she sensed a deeper courtesy than she had known in her old cabin. He watched with the quiet attention of someone who understood fragile things must be approached like skittish birds. Little Elk peeked around the corner, studying the woman with wide eyes. Alice offered a faint smile, though exhaustion kept her from conversation. The boy retreated without sound, satisfied she meant no harm. Alice longed to explain why she was alone in the wilderness, but shame caught her tongue. She feared pity, feared judgment, feared that yet another stranger would demand something in return for kindness. Instead, she focused on the broth, swallowing slowly while the fire warmed her bones. Seyon added more wood to the hearth and said only a few simple words, voice deep as river stones. Rest is medicine. She lay back, letting the hides enfold her. The softness reminded her that she had not experienced gentleness in a very long time. She slept again, dreamless and finally unafraid. Outside, daylight faded. Seyon prepared supper of venison stew and thick cornbread. When Alice woke again, she inhaled the aroma with unexpected hunger. He handed her a clean bowl, and she ate more quickly than she intended, embarrassed by her appetite. He pretended not to notice, sparing her the discomfort of apology. Later, she sat near the fire, fingers tracing the frayed edge of her shawl. Her voice trembled as she finally offered fragments of truth. She had escaped a forced marriage, she had endured beatings, she had walked until her legs could no longer carry her. She admitted she had nowhere left to go. The confession nearly broke her, yet speaking it aloud felt like lifting a stone from her ribs. Seyon listened without interruption. His expression remained solemn, never pitying. When she finished, he tended the kettle with quiet care, offering warm bread as if to say survival deserved nourishment rather than shame. Alice felt seen in a way she could not remember experiencing before. Snow pressed against the windows. Night deepened into velvet silence. Alice leaned closer to the flames, letting comfort seep into her skin. She watched Seyon mend a bridle, while Little Elk carved small figurines from fallen branches. The cabin felt like an island of peace, untouched by Hester's anger or Jedediah's looming threat. Yet Alice understood the settlement might come searching. Jedediah was not a man who surrendered pride, and Hester valued control more than breath. That knowledge gnawed at her until she whispered she could not stay long, fearing she would bring trouble. Seyon met her gaze, voice steady as winter stone, telling her no one deserved to freeze alone. Alice's heartbeat steadied. For the first time since running away, she felt the fragile possibility of belonging, if only for a night. Still, far beyond the cabin walls, somewhere under the same moonlit snow, footsteps and anger would soon rise, hunting what they believed was theirs to reclaim. Snow melted into deeper drifts as days passed in the valley, giving the forest an unspoken fullness. Alice grew stronger each morning, rising before sunrise to help with chores, though Seyon reminded her she owed nothing. She collected eggs, folded blankets, and stirred stew with careful hands, feeling her body rediscover purpose. Little Elk shadowed her quietly, arranging her cooking ingredients or fetching water from the frozen stream. Alice often caught him smiling when she taught him how to braid dough, though he hid it shyly behind his sleeve. Warmth settled into the cabin as if it belonged there, and Alice no longer trembled when she heard the wind lash the roof. Seyon repaired his traps and guided Alice through gentle work she could manage, refusing to let her overexert herself. He noticed the way her eyes softened when she watched the fire, as though she were relearning comfort one ember at a time. He admired her resilience without speaking it aloud. Words could sometimes disturb delicate healing, and he valued silence where hearts could breathe without performance. Yet Alice sensed danger prowling beyond their fragile sanctuary. Jedediah had never been known to accept humiliation, and Hester's pride was brittle and easily wounded. She whispered her worries to Tseyon one evening, while sewing little Elk's mittens. Her voice shook when she imagined Jedediah searching the wilderness, convinced she belonged to him by right. Tseyon listened, eyes shadowed beneath lamplight, then reminded her that fear should not guide the soul. She nodded, though her pulse still hammered whenever distant branches cracked under weight. The days unfolded peacefully, but Alice lived in two worlds: the present warmth of Tseyon's cabin, and the memory of hands that struck without remorse. She sometimes woke abruptly, afraid she had overslept and would pay for idleness. Tseyon heard her restless breathing and stoked the fire, letting its glow anchor her to safety. Alice marveled at how quietly he tended to comfort, never demanding gratitude, never raising his voice. He treated her as though she had always deserved peace, though she struggled to believe it. Then, near the end of afternoon, hoofbeats shattered the calm. Alice froze at the window, pulse racing like a trapped sparrow. Two horsemen rode across the ridge, their silhouettes sharp against pale daylight. Jedediah's posture was unmistakable: rigid shoulders, hat slanted like a threat, body swaying with furious purpose. Beside him rode a ranch hand named Silas, who worked at the town stables and loved gossip almost as much as whiskey. Alice felt the old panic crash over her like winter water. Tseyon stepped outside, unarmed, wearing only a wool coat. Alice watched through the window, unable to swallow. Jedediah reined his horse near the cabin, and demanded to know if a runaway woman had passed through the valley. His tone was sticky with contempt. He insisted Alice belonged in town, and that any man who hid her would answer to local law. Silas nodded aggressively, though his eyes darted uneasily at Tseyon's height and stillness. Tseyon replied with calm brevity that no one deserved to be claimed like livestock. Jedediah scoffed and accused him of lying. Alice trembled in shame, remembering every time Jedediah had reduced her to property. Tseyon remained motionless, yet his presence radiated the quiet ferocity of a stone cliff against a winter storm. Jedediah leaned closer and spat a slur meant to provoke, challenging Tseyon to violence. But Tseyon did not react, his silence heavier than any shout. Silas shifted nervously, sensing the futility of intimidation. Alice pressed her palms against her skirt, torn between hiding forever and stepping outside to defend the man who protected her without asking anything in return. But she stayed still, because speaking would endanger him. Jedediah threatened to return with more men, announcing that settlers would never tolerate an Apache sheltering a runaway wife. He claimed the law sided with him. Tseyon answered simply that the wilderness did not belong to men with papers and signatures. Jedediah cursed, yanked the reins and galloped away, Silas trailing behind like a restless dog. When the riders disappeared, Alice collapsed against the doorframe. Her relief became guilt, thick and heavy. Tseyon returned to the cabin without saying a word. He noticed her trembling and wrapped an additional blanket around her shoulders, though she felt cold from within. She whispered that she should leave to spare him trouble. Tseyon studied her expression, sensing shame more than fear, and reminded her again that winter would take her if she wandered alone. Alice bit her lip, unwilling to risk his safety, yet unable to imagine leaving. That night the fire glowed brighter than usual. Alice cooked broth and cornbread for supper, though her hands moved mechanically. Tseyon watched her carefully, knowing she carried invisible burdens. After little Elk fell asleep, Alice finally confessed that Hester had taught her to believe kindness always required debt. Tseyon shook his head gently. Goodness, he told her, was its own reward. Alice almost cried, yet held herself together with quiet dignity. Snow blew fiercely outside, as if echoing the tension pulsing through the valley. Alice lay awake long after Tseyon and little Elk slept, listening to every distant rustle, afraid the next knock would shatter their sanctuary. She studied Tseyon's sleeping silhouette beside the stove, marveling at how peace could coexist with danger. If Jedediah returned with more men, the cabin would not remain untouched. Before dawn, Alice stepped outside into crisp silence. Sky and frost became one continuous breath. She looked toward the ridge where Jedediah had ridden away, imagining him plotting vengeance over bitter whiskey. Alice felt the ache of responsibility settling into her bones. She did not want her escape to become Tseon's burden. She whispered into the stillness that perhaps she should leave before more trouble arrived. Inside the cabin, Tseon opened his eyes though he had appeared asleep. He breathed steady, very quietly. The morning carried a promise of uncertainty and hidden consequences for them both. Snow fell in slow swirling veils across the valley, carrying the feeling that the world had paused to witness tenderness. Christmas morning approached with a hush that settled deep into the mountains. Alice woke before the first pale light touched the windows, listening to the steady breath of little elk and the quiet crackle of embers resting in the stove. She felt rested in a way she had not felt since childhood, as if the cold weather itself permitted her to begin again without explanation. She slipped from the bedding and kindled the fire gently, feeding it pine chips until flames brightened the cabin. Tseon stirred from his chair where he had slept lightly, always half ready for danger. His gaze softened when he saw Alice tending the morning warmth, as though the simple act held something sacred. She offered him a soft smile without words, and he nodded back with a stillness that spoke more than speech. Outside, snow glistened like powdered silver, and every branch bowed under a dreamlike weight. Alice stepped outside briefly to gather pine boughs. The air smelled sharp and clean, her boots pressing delicate patterns into untouched whiteness. She collected the branches and returned to the cabin, steadying her breath against the icy wind. She braided the boughs together into a small wreath, threading it with strips of cloth torn from an old apron. When she hung it by the window, the cabin felt newly alive, as if joy had tiptoed in without making a fuss. Tseon watched quietly, surprised by how a single decoration shifted the entire room. She decided to bake a small apple bread from the ingredients she had discovered in Tseon's pantry. It was nothing extravagant, but she wanted the day to feel different, like a moment carved from time instead of necessity. As she kneaded the dough, memory rose of her father teaching her how to make bread, his hands guiding hers through the motion. She blinked back emotion, grateful that the past could return without sorrow. Little Elk woke to the warm scent and rubbed his eyes with delight. Alice handed him a wooden spoon and let him stir the batter. He grinned shyly, the first unguarded smile she had seen from him since arriving. Tseon sat near the stove repairing a pair of moccasins, though his gaze drifted toward Alice more often than toward the leather. Something within him seemed astonished that celebration could bloom from ordinary ingredients and patient hands. As the bread baked, Alice rearranged blankets near the hearth so they could sit together with comfort. She placed pine branches at the center of the table and set 3 tin cups in a row. Tseon brought a jar of honey and venison stew from the cellar, heating it slowly over the renewed fire. The cabin filled with aromas that intertwined softly: bread, broth, wood smoke, and something that felt like belonging. When they finally ate, Alice closed her eyes to savor each bite. Tseon watched her without interruption, recognizing how nourishment tasted different when offered freely. Little Elk ate in quiet contentment, feet swinging beneath him in small rhythm. Snow whispered against the roof like a lullaby, the day unfolding at a pace that encouraged breath instead of tension. Later, Alice sat near the window, sewing patches onto her shawl. Tseon approached and handed her a folded cloth bundle. She opened it carefully and gasped when she discovered a hand-woven shawl of deep indigo and faded cream, the edges adorned with delicate beadwork. He murmured that it had belonged to his mother, and carried memories of winters both harsh and tender. Alice felt overwhelmed by the gesture. She traced the beads, each one shining softly in the firelight. She asked if he was sure. Tseon nodded once, saying some memories wished for new life rather than dust and silence. Alice wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, feeling the weight of history mingling with present comfort. Tears shimmered at the corners of her eyes, though she spoke no apology. She told Tseon she had no gift to offer in return except gratitude and a homemade pie, which she would bake tomorrow if flour allowed. Tseon shook his head gently, reminding her that gifts did not measure worth. Alice breathed deeply, realizing that this moment was unlike anything she had known before. She felt seen without being examined, valued without being owned. Evening deepened. They lit candles within small jars, letting golden halos dance across wooden walls. Alice invited little Elk to sit beside her, and taught him a simple carol she remembered from childhood. The boy sang with hesitant voice, then steadied as Tseyon hummed a low harmony. Alice's chest tightened with joy she did not expect. She closed her eyes and let the music fill her spirit. When they finished, Tseyon whispered that he had never spent Christmas with anyone. Alice replied softly that she had never spent it without fear. Something unspoken passed between them, a shared realization that fate sometimes stitched two wounded souls into the same quiet season. Alice rested her head lightly against the wall, her hands wrapped in the indigo shawl, the fire painting warmth across her skin. As they cleaned the supper dishes, Alice noticed Tseyon watching her with thoughtful eyes. He seemed on the verge of saying something heavier than ordinary kindness. Before he could speak, a distant sound echoed through the valley, faint hoofbeats muffled by thickening snow. Alice froze, every drop of comfort draining from her shoulders. Tseyon's gaze sharpened, steady and unafraid. The hoofbeats faded into distance, leaving a silence far colder than wind. Alice clutched the shawl tighter, realizing that Christmas peace did not erase danger. Tomorrow would ask for courage she had not yet named. She reached for the lantern and stood beside the window, searching the ridge for movement, knowing the world outside waited with questions and unfinished storms. She whispered a promise to herself that she would face tomorrow alone, no matter what arrived. Snow thickened overnight, building into tall white walls that muffled every sound except the restless wind. Alice did not sleep. She sensed the valley had been holding its breath since Christmas, waiting for something unavoidable. Tseyon sat by the stove sharpening a hunting blade, not for violence but for ordinary use, though the motion reminded Alice how easily men could become instruments of conflict when provoked. Little Elk slept without worry, trusting that the world would remain gentle simply because Tseyon had always allowed it to be so. When morning came, Alice stepped outside to gather wood, though her legs trembled with unspoken fear. The air tasted metallic, as if danger hid beneath every branch. She looked toward the ridge where hoofbeats had echoed the night before. Nothing stirred, yet she felt watched by memory rather than presence. She whispered to herself that she would leave before harm reached Tseyon's doorstep. The thought burned, sharp and terrible, but she could not witness kindness being punished on her behalf. She returned inside, packing her small bundle while rainwater dripping from thawing icicles tapped against the roof with mournful rhythm. Tseyon noticed her movements and understood before she explained. Alice admitted she would leave by evening, carrying only the shawl and some bread. She said she could not repay the peace he had given, and she could not let men blame him for her escape. Tseyon responded with calm sadness, reminding her that storms did not scatter truth, only strength. Alice lowered her eyes, unable to meet the tenderness he offered so easily. Before she could argue further, hoofbeats thundered through the valley again, loud, reckless, unmistakable. Little Elk awakened with a start. Tseyon rose, steady and unarmed, stepping toward the door. Alice stood frozen, her heart snapping into swift panic. Jedediah and Hester rode through the snow with two other settlers trailing them. Jedediah dismounted, his face swollen with rage, whiskey fumes trailing behind him like sour perfume. Hester pointed toward the cabin, and declared Alice belonged to her household, and had disgraced the settlement with rebellion. Alice stepped outside before Tseyon could shield her. Jedediah marched forward, voice slurred with fury, yelling that Alice would return or face consequences. He claimed law gave him every right. Alice's voice did not shake when she replied that she owed him nothing. Not obedience, not marriage, not her breath. Jedediah scoffed and reached for her wrist. Before his fingers tightened, Tseyon stepped between them, expression firm but not hostile. Jedediah shouted that no Apache had authority over his affairs. He swung his arm toward Tseyon as if expecting him to strike back. Tseyon caught his wrist gently, holding it still with the strength of immovable earth. Jedediah swung again, but anger collapsed beneath the quiet discipline of Tseyon's restraint. The settlers gasped, expecting violence. Yet Seyon did nothing but stop harm without returning it. Alice felt tears sting, realizing the man before her chose peace when most men chose pride. Hester yelled that Alice had been fed and clothed, and therefore owed submission. Alice shouted back that kindness without cruelty had never existed under that roof. She declared she would rather live in wilderness with dignity than in a cabin with fear. Hester's mouth twisted, and she ordered Jedediah to drag Alice home. Jedediah lunged again, but Seyon blocked him with a single step, voice low and clear, telling the men to leave the valley. Jedediah swore he would return with the sheriff. Snow whipped between them like restless spirits. Jedediah turned to strike Alice one last time out of humiliation. Seyon moved faster, lifting his arm to intercept the blow without anger. The moment felt timeless, the arrogant force of a man accustomed to domination meeting the steady presence of someone who understood the weight of gentleness. Jedediah stumbled into the snow, face red with fury he could not satisfy. The settlers, uncertain and ashamed, urged him to retreat. Their fear of escalation outweighed loyalty. Jedediah pointed at Alice with trembling rage and promised she would regret everything. He mounted his horse and galloped away, Hester following reluctantly. The valley fell silent again, the cold deepening as though the mountains exhaled relief. Alice collapsed into the snow, shaking from exhaustion rather than weather. Seyon helped her stand, offering strength without judgment. Little Elk took her hand timidly, guiding her back into the cabin. Alice warmed her fingers by the fire, and whispered that she had not wished for conflict. Seyon said she had wished for freedom, and some freedom required confrontation. Night gathered early, wrapping them in darkness. The cabin glowed with golden flicker. Alice stared into the flames, thinking of her father, of hunger, of yearning, of how safety can exist like a fragile hush rather than a promise. She turned toward Seyon, realizing that his presence had restored something she never expected to reclaim: the right to feel unafraid. She walked to him slowly, shawl trailing like dusk-stained wings. She confessed that she had prepared to leave before the riders arrived, convinced danger would destroy his peace. Seyon listened with steady breath. She admitted she had never wanted to leave, that her heart had begun to memorize the shape of safety inside these walls. Seyon placed a pot of tea on the stove and sat beside her, as if the confession belonged to everyday life. In a voice soft as falling ash, Seyon told her he had lived many winters alone, because connection always arrived tangled with prejudice or haste. He never expected someone to see him as a home rather than a warning. Alice's chest tightened, not from fear but recognition. He continued more quietly, saying he did not love quickly and did not speak lightly, yet love was already present like sunrise, whether named or not. Alice reached for his hand, and her tears fell without shame. She whispered that she loved him for the calm he carried, for the patience he offered, and for the way he saw her as a person rather than a possession. Seyon rested his forehead against hers, and promised that no harm would make him regret protecting her. Outside, the mountains held their silence like witness. Weeks later, they wed beneath cedar smoke and candlelight, exchanging vows as simple as breath. Little Elk draped pine around Alice's shoulders, smiling shyly. She leaned against Seyon, feeling her life open like a door she had never dared to approach. If this story moved you, pause a moment, breathe deeply, and press like, comment your favorite moment, and subscribe for more Wild West tales of love and quiet courage. Tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight, so our stories may travel farther than loneliness ever could.